Hello everybody, today we continue my journey with this first generation DB9, formerly of Ben from Dad Cars, and my quest to turn it into the perfect first Aston Martin. In the last episode we finished on a bit of a cliffhanger as the car was left on the ramp at Bamford Rose, awaiting their final and full inspection. But what did they find, and is this yet another car that's going to try and bankrupt me? Well, find out in today's episode of JM on Cars. For those just joining the adventure, allow me to bring you quickly up to speed. This car was purchased a number of years ago by my good friend Ben from the channel Dad Cars because it was always his dream to one day own an Aston Martin DB9, and though by that time he already had 3 children, he was the sort of person that didn't want children to get in the way of him enjoying his dream. Instead, he wanted to share it with them, and that was the genesis of his channel. I then met him about a year ago, by which time he then had 4 children, and this was an issue because the DB9 is a strict 4-seater, and so when there were 3 he could go out and enjoy the car with the kids, but when there were 4 he could not. And having committed to YouTube, he also wanted to free up a little bit of capital. So we struck a deal that worked for us both. Not all that long before, I'd bought a Maserati Grand Sport, a car that I'd been lusting after for quite some time. I took it on my customary trip up to Scotland, and though I really enjoyed it, I simply failed to fall in love with it. So, on my return, I decided that I would move it on. Ben then took it out for a review and really found himself falling for it. More importantly, this was a car that was not only half the price of the Aston, but also had the flat rear seating that would be required to turn it into a 5-seater.
Is it cool that all 3 of you can sit back there now? Yeah. Yeah?
I'd always thought about buying an Aston Martin for myself, and seeing an opportunity to get into a car that was a relatively known quantity, though not my perfect Aston, I figured the obvious thing to do was for us to switch cars. This way, Ben could have his 5-seater and some money in the bank, this being worth quite a bit more than the Maserati, and I would have the Aston Martin I'd always said I was going to buy, but somehow never did. Like myself, Ben takes great pride in his cars, and so I was fairly happy buying this, knowing that the only outstanding issues were going to be cosmetic. The car had had some corrosion issues, and long story short, the rectification job was bodged, meaning that at some point, essentially, this whole half of the car would need a respray, but that was fine. It was an issue that I knew about, and this meant I could drive the car through the winter and not really worry about scraping this side down a hedgerow, which is quite refreshing. From day one, the plan was always to have the car for about 6 months, do the work to it, and then move it on. Why? Well, simply put, this, a first-generation DB9, is not the Aston of my dreams. I still lust after a DBS, a Vantage, or a Vanquish, but the fact is, they're quite a bit more money than one of these. For the examples that I'd want, really about double. And so I viewed this as an extended test drive, a way really to get a feel for Aston life and see whether it would be for me. Because if I'm going to spend £70,000 on one of those cars, I have to really want it. And so this, I thought, was a good way to see if I was going to be disappointed or not. Just in case you're sat there thinking, well, that doesn't really make much sense. How could you test drive a Vantage by driving a DB9? Well, yes, though they are different, the cars also have quite a bit in common, with all of them being part of what is known as the VH era of Aston Martin. VH standing for vertical horizontal, their name for the chassis on which all of these cars were built, effectively a series of bonded aluminium extrusions. And though the cars are not identical to one another, of course a Vantage is different to a Rapide, fundamentally, they are more similar than they are different, and so I would wager if you don't like one, you probably won't like the other. Because of this, there was only ever one place I was going to take the DB9 to. That is Mike over at Bamford Rose. You see, they, over the last few years, have developed a reputation as the specialist for VH-era Aston Martin cars, with Mike himself having been a powertrain engineer for this exact car, working on both the earlier and later versions of the V12 that sits under its bonnet. So, in the last episode, we went over to Bamford Rose, spoke to Mike, who talked about the DB9 and other VH platform cars, some of the problems that can affect them, and we were also able to get it on the ramp, where we were delighted to see that it appeared to be in very good condition, with there being clear signs that the previous mechanics, Phoenix, Aston Martin, who looked after it for Ben, having done a very good job. All in, I was very happy. When we left it, the plan was for Mike to do a few mechanical bits that we'd already talked about, and also a full inspection of the car, the results of which I have here. And the good news is that we didn't really find anything untowards. So, where do we begin? Well, first off, one of my lambda sensors wasn't quite right. That got replaced at £150. The rear brake pads were due, that was £370. And in fact, the biggest single job that was unexpected was the door modules. They control the action of the window going up and down when you open the lever and various other things. A well-known failure point, and one that cost £872 to sort. These were fixed by the fitment of newer specification but OE parts. Aston Martin knew there was an issue, and apparently the new ones are much better, so hopefully that is not something that we'll ever need doing again. The wing mirror stalk, so this little bit here on the passenger side, had started to flake, another common issue, so common in fact that Bamford just keep them on the shelves. That got fitted, and that was £368. I had also supplied 2 new front tyres for the car, Michelin PS4S, as one of them had been damaged, so they fitted those, and the door struts themselves were replaced at just £60 for the pair, meaning that now, when you open them, they stay in place as they should. Aston doors open at a sort of 15-degree angle, so if the strut isn't quite right, very often you'll find it just tries to trap your leg all the time. All in, I am really very happy. Having quite a bit of experience now with cars like this, for a first visit to the dealer or specialist, that was actually a fairly small list, and proof that Ben really had taken fairly good care of his car. Because the inspection process is essentially the same as a service, we had one of those carried out as well. Bamford did a major, which includes the oil, filter, air filter, pollen filter, and the wiper blades, though crucially, not the spark plugs. That's a big job, and simply put, they just weren't necessary. That is about £650. After that, there were just 2 remaining things I wanted to sort with this car. First of which was the exhaust. Though it makes a nice noise, to me, for a 6-litre, naturally aspirated 48-valve, near 500 horsepower V12, it's just not quite meaty enough, and so I wanted just a little bit more volume. Not much, just a bit. Initially, I wanted to do one of Bamford Rose's secondary decats, which is actually something that the factory did themselves on many of their sport exhaust systems. However, having spoken to Mike about it, he very kindly agreed to upgrade me at their cost to their primary decat system, then coupled with an uprated high-flow secondary. Doing this does take a little bit longer and is a little bit more expensive. The RRP on this is £2,500. So, thank you, Mike, you legend. What they do is remove your manifolds, and the cats themselves are basically that far away from the engine. Those are ceramic, and if the car isn't running entirely right, can lead to parts of the cat being ingested by the car, which of course will lunch the engine that, by the way, is basically impossible to replace. That aside, it is an incredibly durable unit, but this, though rare, very rare, is something that can happen. They take those out and therefore eliminate ever the possibility of that happening. To compensate, of course, the secondaries do have to be uprated, and normally I wouldn't go in for this sort of thing, were it not for the fact that because Mike worked on these cars and knows the engine in particular well, he of course knows what he is talking about. So we've had that fitted. The biggest issue with this car, though, was the way that it drove. As soon as I got it from Ben and I took it out on some of my favourite roads, something wasn't quite right. The car was very crashy, and I've driven enough Aston Martins now to know that properly set up, they can be an absolute delight. This, though, was very uncooperative. It would thump along the road and never really work with it in the way that a proper GT should. In fact, before the car had even gone on the ramp at Bamford Rose, Mike had diagnosed exactly what was going on. You see, this particular car is fitted with dampers from a company called Dynamics, who had been Aston Martin's supplier up until about 2008, when they were replaced with Bilstein, who overall gave them a much better product at a much lower price. The theory was that any 2009 DB9 should have Bilstein dampers, but this is a sport pack car, which generally speaking is seen as a very desirable thing. But it turns out that some very early 2009 sport pack cars got the very last of the Dynamics dampers that were on the shelf. And that left me in a bit of a quandary, because on the one hand, great, we know what the issue is, but on the other, to fix it requires the replacement of all the shocks and springs with the later Aston Martin OE spec Bilsteins, and that was going to come to about £4,000. £4,000 that I had not budgeted into my purchase of this car. But to be honest with you, it didn't take long for me to make my mind up. As far as I'm concerned, if I was looking at this car, I wouldn't have bought it driving the way that it did. So I said to Mike, let's get that sorted. And so, while the car was away, he took the old Dynamics dampers off and fitted a brand spanking new set of Bilsteins, meaning not only should the car handle better, but the suspension has also had a good refresh, there being a chance that the old system at 50,000 miles was already past its best anyway. But as they say, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and the proof of the car is to be found on the road. So, has all this extra expense been worth it? Have we transformed this car and turned it into the DB9 that I wanted it to be? Well, let's see. In a word, yes. In 3 words, yes, yes, yes. Before I'd even got out the car park at Bamford Rose, I could already feel the difference that suspension was making. Where the old setup would lump and bump and crash, even at walking speed, this one felt like the car had gained another 1.5 inches of suspension travel. It felt genuinely plush at 5 miles an hour, which I know might be inconsequential to many, but to me, it's important. Your very first impressions of a car are going to be in the car park at low speeds, and if in that scenario it already makes you feel like it's just not a very pleasant thing, well, you're not likely really going to want to buy it, are you? And more to the point, if you do spend a lot of time in traffic and the like, it is nice to have a car that's just a little bit more cosseting. But of course, for the vast majority of people, of far greater importance is going to be how the car now handles a difficult tarmac at speed. And I am delighted to say, there, it is also transformed. Now, when you get the car up to 50, 60 miles an hour and take it down a stretch like this, which is a very demanding piece of tarmac, it really works. You can feel the suspension doing its job, and it feels like somebody's come along and ironed the whole road for me. Previously, this was just unenjoyable in the car, and the fact is, when the suspension is too stiff, it then becomes dangerous, because what the car wants to do is skip, and that's not good. This works with the road. It achieves the Lotus effect. It gets that magic carpet ride quality and is just magnificent. I am a big fan of a well set up passive suspension system, and that is what this car now has. It's a joy. As I'm sure you can probably tell, conditions today aren't exactly ideal for having a lot of fun. But I have had the chance to drive the car when things have been a little bit better, and I can attest to what Bamford Rose promised. The car is better in essentially all scenarios. Between about 20 and 40 mile an hour, I would say that it's closest to how the old system felt, with still that little edge of patter you'd expect from a car like this with the Sport Pack equipped. These are Sport Pack Bilstein dampers we have on, but it just works when you want to have fun, and that to me is absolutely crucial. For motorway journeys too, the car is now so much more cosseting, so much more enjoyable, and so much more like an Aston Martin should be. This, after all, is the very definition of a GT, and if it can't do that sort of thing, then to me, it's just useless. Originally, my plan was to give this car a proper shakedown on my favourite routes up in Scotland, and I'd even planned a journey specifically for that. But as the week approached, the weather reports became ever more severe, and it turned out at one point there were some 200 cars stranded in various places on the route I would have had to have taken to get up to Scotland. And then there was a very good chance, had I got there, the road I wanted to drive would have been shut. So unfortunately, I've instead had to do my shakedown here. But as from a testing perspective, the chief difference between those roads and these is the scenery. I've still been able to do what I wanted to. And now I've put about 1,000 miles on the car since it got the new suspension. Ben himself has also had a chance to drive the car and attest to just how improved it is. And I am very, very happy with what we have had done. So then, next up, the exhaust. And my real concern was that with that primary decat, it was just going to be far too raucous. However, once again, Mike at Bamford Rose has steered me absolutely right. This system is now set up just perfectly. The car is now running the Bamford Rose valve controller, which replaces the old system that Ben had, which was done off a little remote fob like this. Instead, it's a hardwired switch down here, which is very simple, well hidden, and rather elegant. It has 3 position settings: automatic, where the car does what it normally would regarding the valves; on, i.e. valves permanently open; and then off, valves permanently shut. Right now, I'm driving it with the valves shut, and it's nice and quiet. I would say halfway between the old valve open and shut setting. But then when you want to have a little bit of fun, you can set them open, and now it sounds like an Aston should. And there is another unintended but not undesirable consequence of this change, which is the fact the car now makes about 500 horsepower. In fact, according to Mike, it should be making no less than 500, which is nice. In case you are wondering, the difference between this engine and the DBS is minimal. Internally, they are identical. The change was in the way that the intakes were run. So the DB9 has a longer runner for better low-down torque, and the DBS a shorter one for better high-end power. The issue Aston Martin then encountered was, though the DBS was more powerful at 510 horses versus 470, because of the lack of low-down torque, it was actually slower in the 0 to 60 dash, and so for the DBS they had to put on a new shorter rear differential to make up for the shortfall, meaning that actually in most real-world scenarios this is a quicker car than a DBS. It's got more of the power where you need it. And now, from about 2.5 up to 6,500 RPM, the car has a noticeable amount more shove. It's just got a little bit more torque all the time. Not that it was lacking ever, but now it's just a little less lacking. Having that fresh set of tyres on the front also means that even today, when conditions really aren't on my side, I can still go out and enjoy the car. It is a magnificent thing. And now the car is virtually complete. All that is remaining is the cosmetic work. So next week it is heading back to Bamford Rose, who are going to have the exterior resprayed and done to the standard that it should always have been. And they have a paint guy there who is ex-factory, so he knows what the car should be like. Inside, we're also going to do just a few small things to, again, bring the car a little bit more up to date. We're just going to be replicating all of the things that the factory themselves did to some of the later cars. We'll be fitting a set of the later, much nicer glass buttons. I'm going to extend the piano black that's here on the ski slope down a little bit, because at the moment it just looks a touch weird. We're going to make some alterations to this little side piece here, to the sill, and various other small touches, just to make the car feel that little bit fresher and newer, but without ruining it. And then it's going to go up for sale. So This is the video in which I say, if you fancy yourself an Aston Martin DB9 that has been very well cared for, is currently sat at just under 54,000 miles and is going to be super usable with a bunch of very desirable yet sympathetic upgrades, email me now. Both Ben and myself would love this car to be essentially kept within the family, and so it would be amazing if this could go to a subscriber. My email address is in the description down below, but if you can't find it, it's talk@jayemm.com. I'm going to try and price the car as reasonably as I can. I know I'm going to be losing money on it, but that honestly was never particularly important. I wanted to just make sure this car was done right by me, because that is what I promised Ben. So then, that is the end of today's episode on the DB9, but not quite the end of its story. In the next installment, I'll be showing it to you in all of its glory, having had all the cosmetic work done, and, if I'm lucky, also telling you whether we've managed to find a buyer. If you email me quickly and are interested in this car, you've got the opportunity to have some input on what exactly we do with the car, particularly regarding the interior. There's lots and lots of things that could be done. So if it's something you're thinking about, please do not delay. And if you're watching this in 2028, there's a good chance the car has already gone. Anyway, I want to say a massive thank you to Bamford Rose for being quite so supportive and amazing, and of course to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you for the next one. Bye bye.